Notion's most distinctive advantage is its unique integration of databases and documents, where unlike any other tool, you can open up any item of a Notion database as a fully functional document. It's as if you could open up any row of a Google Sheet as a Google Doc. And this feature is made even more powerful by the Relation and Rollup properties of Notion databases, and they're really a part of any sophisticated Notion workspace and the cornerstone of my bulletproof methodology. So let's dive into relations and rollups, what they are, why they're useful, and just how to implement them. So the relation property allows you to link database items to other database items. And when you create a relation, you link it to a database. And then you populate the property by choosing items from that linked database. It's like a select property, but your options are items of that linked database. And typically you link the relation property to another database, but sometimes you'll choose the same database, and that will allow you to relate items to other items within that same database. And these relations between database items often represent parent-child relationships, where one item, the parent, is sort of the classification or the grouping of its related items, which are the children. So in one common example, we have a contacts database and we have a companies database. And each of these databases has a reciprocal relation property. So in the contacts database, we have a relation property that's related to the companies database. And in the companies database, we have a reciprocal relation property that's related to the contacts database. So what we can do to populate this company property is choose any item from this company's database. And conversely, for the contacts property of the company's database, we can choose from the contacts database. So if we remove Microsoft from the Steve Ballmer item here, and we click into the property, we see all of those companies available for choosing. So if we choose Microsoft, it's going to populate next to Steve Ballmer, and Steve Ballmer is going to be added to the contacts property of Microsoft within companies. So some other examples of these sort of parent-child relationships include manufacturers and their products, projects and their tasks, objectives and their key results, authors and their articles, shows and their episodes, expense categories and their individual expenses, years and months, classes and their students, teams and players, clients and invoices, airlines and flights, and departments or teams and their meetings. So you can get the idea here where the parent is sort of a single item that groups its children. And in Notion, these are going to be represented by independent databases. But these relationships aren't always hierarchical. They're not always a parent-child relationship. In one example of a non-hierarchical relationship, you could have dependent tasks, where task B depends on task A before it can be completed. So in this example, in a tasks database, the relation property would relate to itself, so that for task B, as the dependency, you could choose task A. For any task, you could choose another task from the same database as the dependency. In another example of a non-hierarchical relationship, you could have tasks that depend on resources. So these would be independent databases, a tasks database and a resources database. And for each task, you could choose one or more resources to reference for completing the task. So these relation properties afford us numerous benefits, but some of the most notable include the accuracy and consistency of information that we input across our workspace. So when you choose options from a central repository, in this case, the other database, the related database, it's going to ensure that that value appears consistently throughout your workspace. And among other benefits, this is going to avoid any disruption to your filtering and sorting rules. So if you look at this contacts database here, if we were to enter the company for these contacts within just a free-form text field, we could enter that company in a variety of different ways. But by using a relation property that relates to a centralized company's database, we choose that company from its central location, and that ensures that it's entered consistently every time. Relations are also going to reduce redundancy in your work and save you time. So across your workspace, you're likely to want to reference companies in multiple databases. We saw how we'd reference them within the contacts database. But in another example, if you're tracking your expenses in Notion, you want to indicate a vendor for each expense, which is another form of company. And even if you were to use a select property for your companies in each of these databases, you're going to have accurate inputs for the most part. However, you're going to have to create almost an identical company property in each of these databases. So rather than doing that in these databases and any others that reference a company, you can just retain this relation to the company's database and contacts. And within expenses, you can create another relation to the company's database, and there you'll have all of those same options from which to choose. And any other databases that need to reference a company, you can just add another relation property and you retain this central repository of companies that keep your information accurate and consistent and also reduce redundancy in your work. And then relations are going to automate filtered views of your databases. So you'll often want to filter child databases by their parents. For example, you want to view players by team and tasks by project. So with relations and database templates, you can automatically filter children within their parents. Continuing our companies and contacts example, if we open up the Apple company, we can see a filtered view of the contacts database, and it displays only the contacts that are related to Apple. And this can be automated within each company. So if we wipe out this contacts view, you can see that we have a company template configured here. If we click on the template, then the inner contents are going to populate automatically with this nice filtered view of contacts. And we can simply click on that template within any company and have its own unique filtered view automatically populated. And relations also allow us to summarize information and reveal useful insights. So as we'll explore here in a second, the Rollup property allows you to aggregate information from related items, and you can then perform calculations on that information to reveal those useful insights. So with these expense categories and expenses, we have independent databases where the categories are sort of the parents of the individual expenses. And each expense is related to a category from the expense categories database. And then, of course, we have the reciprocal expenses property within expense categories that is populated with each of that category's expenses. So what that allows us to do is implement this Rollup property that retrieves all of the totals from the related expenses, and then it sums those totals to determine the total expense within each category. And the last benefit I'll mention is that relations kind of streamline the navigation of your workspace. So for any populated related item, you can simply click into the property and then click on an item, and that's going to open up the item as a page. So in this example, in a more complete workspace, each of these contacts might have a full profile within the page, and that'll allow you to explore the employee profiles via the companies in a really streamlined way. So let's take a look at just how we create these relations. Here we have our contacts and our companies database displaying only their title property. And I've added this R&R to the end of each name because you'll see we'll want these databases to be easy to search for. And truthfully, I have a lot of contacts and companies databases in my workspace. So you'll create a property just like any other property, and you want to name it according to the content that you'll be populating it with. So in this case, we're going to be adding the company for each contact, so we can just name it company. And I'll just add a little V2 here because I do have an existing company property. And for the property type, you'll choose relation, and then you'll have a module that prompts you to link it to a database. So what you can do here is search for that database. This is why I included that R&R in the name. And like I said, you'll most often be linking it to another database. So we can search for the company's database, the R&R version of it, select it there and click Create Relation. And that is going to allow us to click into any of these cells and choose one or more companies for any of these contacts. But when you create that relation property, it's going to create a reciprocal relation, which we can show by going into Properties here, and we'll toggle that on. And this is going to have a default name that you're going to want to change. So again, we want it to reference the items that you'll be populating within the property. In this case, we're going to be populating it with contacts. In this context, you could also name this property employees, for example, but I'll just give it a little V2 here since we already have a contacts property behind the scenes. And so now with that in place, like I said, you can choose a company for each contact. So for Steve Ballmer, we'll add the Microsoft company, and then within Microsoft we can see that Steve Ballmer has been added. And then reciprocally within Microsoft we could also add Bill Gates. And after you choose an item, you're going to need a search in order to add any others. So we can add Bill Gates here, and then we can see up here that Microsoft has been added within Bill Gates. And then on some occasions, you're going to relate a database to itself. And as I mentioned, an example of that would be dependent tasks. So within this tasks database, we can add a property just as we did previously, and we can call it dependency. And I'll give it that V2 because we already have one. And just as we did before, we'll choose the relation property again. And this time we're just going to search for the exact same database that we're adding this property to, which is the tasks database. Now, when you do that, because it's the same database, you're going to have the choice to create syncing or a two-way relationship, just as we saw in those separate databases where you have a reciprocal relation property, or you can have non-syncing, in which case you're not going to have a reciprocal relation property. So for any task, you can choose a dependency, but for that dependency, you wouldn't really have a way of knowing which tasks depend on it, which may or may not matter for you. In most cases, knowing the reciprocal items will be helpful, but it's not required in many cases. So if you do choose the two-way syncing and click Create Relation, then that reciprocal property is going to be added within the same database. So if we rename this to dependence, for example, if we add a dependency to a task, of course, we can click into any task and we can choose among all of the tasks within the same database. So if compose strategy depends first on the goals and objectives, then we can see that when we add define goals and objectives as the dependency for compose strategy, then it reciprocally appears within defined goals and objectives. So you can see the two-way relationship in action. If we were to opt out of syncing and only have the dependency property, then this reciprocal wouldn't appear. In some cases, it's useful. In other cases, it's unnecessary. In your practical implementation of relations within the same database, you'll get a sense of when it's useful for you. So rollups are extensions of relations. They retrieve and aggregate other properties from related items, and then they perform calculations on the values that they retrieve to reveal useful insights, as we began to explore just a moment ago. So we talked about expense categories and expenses. And just to recap, each expense category is related to multiple expenses, and then reciprocally, each expense is related to a category. And so what that allows us to do is use a rollup property to retrieve all of the totals of the related expenses for each category, and then we can perform a variety of calculations on those retrieved values. In this case, we sum them. So rollups can perform a variety of calculations on the values that they retrieve. Some of those calculations are applicable for all value types, and some are specific to value types. So a few examples that are used most commonly include just showing the original values, which is just going to comma separate the values that are retrieved. You can show just the unique values. You can count the values. You can count the unique values. You can count the empty ones. You can count the not empty ones. You can display the percent empty, the percent not empty, and you can display the range. And then specific to numbers, you can display the minimum number, the maximum. You can sum them, as we saw with the expenses. You can average them, and you can display the median. For dates, you can display the earliest and latest dates. And then when you retrieve checkboxes, you can count the number that are checked. You can count the number that is unchecked. You can show the percent checked and the percent unchecked. So because rollups retrieve information from related values, you need that relation property in place before you create your rollup. So once that's established, you'll add a property just like any other property. And again, you want to name it to represent the value that it will ultimately display. So in this case, it makes sense just to name it total because it's going to be summing the totals of all of the related expenses. So you'll choose the rollup type. And then you can click into any cell within that property, and you're going to define 3 configuration settings. So the first one is going to be that relation property for which you want to retrieve information. In this case, it's the expenses relation, which happens to be the only relation of this database. And then the second setting is going to be the property within that related database that you want to retrieve. So for each related expense, we want to pull in the total. And then the calculation property is that calculation that we want to perform on those values. So in the case of totaling, we want to sum them. And there we have the total of each expense category as a sum of the total of each related expense. So looking at another couple of examples of rollups, we can calculate the average age of each company's employees. So in these configuration settings for the relation, we've chosen the contacts relation. And then from that contacts database, we want to retrieve the age of each related contact. And then with those retrieved values, we want to calculate the average. And then because rollups can display the percent of checked checkboxes, we can display the progress of projects as a percent of completed tasks. So in these projects and tasks databases here, you can see that we have all of these tasks related to this one project, the Blue Ribbon Sushi website project. And a portion of these tasks are checked complete. So Within this rollup property, we've chosen the tasks relation. We're retrieving the complete property. And for the calculation, we're displaying the percent checked. And so we have determined that the progress of the project is 44% based on the percent of completed tasks related to that project. So you'll really get a sense of the immense utility of relations and rollups through your own practical application. And as you do so, if you encounter any hurdles, feel free to fire any questions my way on Twitter. You'll find me at William Nutt.